How does one man, his jaw shattered by a bullet, alone at a World War II artillery piece designed for 6, keep firing into an advancing army of 250 soldiers for over an hour? Before we answer that, consider this. The British government knew exactly what he did, knew it met every standard for the Victoria Cross, and chose not to award it. Not because his courage was in any way insufficient, because the war he died in was officially supposed to not exist. Today we are pulling open the classified file on Britain's most decorated, but not decorated battle of the Cold War. A fight so secret that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom did not even know it was happening. A battle where 9 men and a relic artillery gun stood between a Marxist revolution and control of the oil supply that kept the Western world moving. What happened on the morning of the 19th of July, 1972, in a small port town on the Arabian Sea, has never received the recognition it deserves. That changes now. To understand why 9 men in an ancient port town mattered to the entire Western world, one must first understand the man who made their presence necessary. Sultan Said bin Taimur had ruled the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman since the 1930s, and his vision of governance belonged to a different century entirely. He banned radios from his kingdom. He banned modern medicine. He banned eyeglasses. He prohibited his subjects from wearing shoes in the city of Salalah unless they had his personal permission, and he prevented the building of schools on the grounds that education would give his people dangerous ideas. In a country sitting on significant oil reserves in the early 1960s, he spent almost nothing on development, infrastructure, or the welfare of the people he ruled. If a medieval sultan had somehow survived into the age of the Cold War and been given a functioning state to mismanage, he would have looked a great deal like Said bin Taimur. The southern province of Oman, Dhofar, bore the worst of it. Dhofar was geographically and culturally distinct from the rest of Oman, its people speaking a different language. Its landscape transformed each year by the Kharif monsoon into lush green hills that the Arabs called the Jebel. The Jebalis, the mountain people of Dhofar, had their own traditions, their own tribal structures, their own relationship with the land that Said had spent years suppressing. By 1962, the resentment had boiled over into armed resistance. A tribal leader named Musallam bin Nufal organized the first fighters under the banner of the Dhofar Liberation Front, demanding nothing more radical than autonomy and the removal of British colonial influence from Oman. At that stage, it was a local grievance. Then the world intervened. In December of 1967, Britain withdrew from Aden, its colonial possession on the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. What replaced British authority was a Marxist-Leninist government in what became the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, South Yemen, sharing a long and porous border with Dhofar. The new South Yemeni government immediately recognized the Dhofar rebels as ideological brothers and opened its territory to them. Training camps appeared near the border town of Hof. Arms shipments arrived from the Soviet Union and China. Young Dhofari men were sent to study guerrilla warfare, not just in Yemen, but in China and Russia itself, returning with military skills, Marxist ideology, and weapons that made the Sultan's forces look like a colonial-era police force. By 1968, the movement had renamed itself the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, the PFLOAG, and had abandoned its limited local objectives entirely. It now intended to liberate the entire Arabian Peninsula from Western influence, to nationalize oil companies, and to establish a Marxist republic stretching from Yemen to the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow channel of water where the Arabian Peninsula nearly touches Iran, through which approximately 1/3 of the world's oil supply transited in the early 1970s. Oman's Musandam Peninsula sits at its southern shore like a dagger pointed at the Persian Gulf's throat. If the PFLOAG succeeded, if Oman fell into the communist orbit, that dagger would be in Marxist hands. The Shah of Iran understood this with visceral clarity, explaining his own eventual intervention in Oman by stating that the Strait of Hormuz represented a matter of national survival. American and British intelligence understood it. The CIA was monitoring the rebellion actively by 1972, producing intelligence memoranda with titles like The Mountain and The Plain, The Rebellion in Oman. 9 men in a dusty port town were, without knowing it, standing guard over the energy supply that kept Western civilization functioning. By 1970, the PFLOAG controlled approximately 80% of the Jebel Dhofar. The Sultan's armed forces, chronically underfunded and poorly led, had been unable to contain them. Terror had become the PFLOAG's instrument of control. 5 elderly tribal sheikhs were pushed over a 450-foot cliff as a lesson to those who resisted. Others were machine-gunned alongside their sons. Children were forcibly removed from their families and transported to South Yemen for political education. Then in July of 1970, something changed. Sultan Saeed bin Taimur's own son, Qaboos, who had been educated at Sandhurst and commissioned into the British Army, staged a palace coup with the quiet backing of British intelligence and removed his father from power. Said went into exile in London, where he would die 2 years later, having destroyed the country he was given to protect. Qaboos immediately reversed 2 decades of deliberate backwardness. Schools opened, modern medicine arrived, an amnesty was offered to fighters willing to put down their weapons. And within hours of the coup, elements of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment were on aircraft heading to Oman. Officially, they were a British Army training team, the BAT, there to advise and instruct. The fiction was maintained at the highest levels of British government. The mission was so politically sensitive that when Harold Wilson won the general election of 1974 and became Prime Minister, he was not informed of the full scope of British military involvement in Oman until after taking office. His own government was fighting a war in secret. The SAS men operating in Dhofar were told that if they were killed, they would be listed as having died in training accidents. There would be no official funerals, no citations, no public acknowledgement that they had ever been there. Families would receive the minimum information that notification of a death required, nothing more. The press would be told nothing. The regiment's dead would be filed under the administrative fictions that governments reach for when they need to wage war without admitting it. The men understood all of this. They accepted these terms not because they were indifferent to recognition, but because the mission itself, they believed, was worth that price. They went to work. The strategy they brought was drawn from the successful template of the Malayan emergency 2 decades earlier. A combination of military pressure and genuine civil development that would win the Jabalis' loyalty rather than simply attempt to terrorize them into submission. SAS teams lived among the mountain tribes, brought medical care to villages that had never seen a doctor, built water wells, and recruited defecting PFLOAG fighters into loyalist tribal militias called Furqats. These former Adu, the word the Sultan's forces used for the enemy, meaning simply enemy in Arabic, proved to be highly effective fighters once their genuine grievances were addressed rather than ignored. By March of 1971, 201 Adu had crossed to the Sultan's side. By the end of the war, the number would exceed 800. The strategy was working. Then came Operation Jaguar in the autumn of 1971, an SAS-led push that drove the PFLOAG back from significant portions of the eastern Jebel and accelerated the defections dramatically. The PFLOAG leadership convened emergency meetings to assess what was happening. Their conclusion was grim. The population they claimed to represent was beginning to question them. The promises of an equal society rang hollow against the visible results of the Sultan's development program. The brutal enforcement methods that had kept the Jebelis in line, the executions, the children taken from their families, the religious persecution had generated a hatred the PFLOAG had not anticipated. They needed a victory, not a guerrilla ambush, not a propaganda statement, but a genuine military triumph that would demonstrate, visibly and undeniably, that the revolution was still winning. They chose Mirbat. Mirbat was a small coastal port on the Arabian Sea, 80 kilometers east of Salalah, ancient and quiet. It had once been a wealthy frankincense trading hub, its harbor silted over centuries ago, its stone buildings weathered by salt wind and monsoon rain into a kind of permanent dignified shabbiness. It sat at the base of the Jebel Samhan Massif, with the mountains rising steeply to the north and the blue expanse of the Arabian Sea stretching to the south. What made it militarily significant was what it represented rather than what it contained. Mirbat housed a furqat of former PFLOAG fighters who had defected to the Sultan's side, men the PFLOAG regarded as traitors of the worst kind, collaborators who had taken the Sultan's money and turned their weapons on their former comrades. If the Adu could retake Mirbat, execute the local governor and his advisors publicly, hold the town long enough to force-feed its population a political lecture, and then vanish back into the Jebel before reinforcements arrived from Salalah, the political effect would be enormous. It would prove that no one was safe, that loyalty to the Sultan meant nothing, that the revolution could reach anywhere and punish anyone. Intelligence gathered from prisoners after the battle would confirm that the PFLOAG planned for Mirbat to be their Tet offensive, a spectacular strike designed to shatter the government's claim to authority and demonstrate that the war was far from over. The town's defenses, on paper, were adequate for their purpose. Outside the main settlement stood the British Army Training Team House, a fortified building with sandbagged positions on its roof and at ground level, home to the 9 SAS men of B Squadron's current rotation. 300 meters north of the BATT house stood the Wali's Fort, a traditional Omani stone structure manned by 9 Omani Army Special Forces soldiers. Adjacent to the Wali's Fort, in a sandbagged emplacement designated number 10, sat a single artillery piece, a World War Tuera QF 25-pounder field gun assigned to the position as a heavy fire support option. Its designated operator was an Omani soldier named Walid Khamis. Between the bat house and the gun pit stretched approximately 500 meters of flat, open ground, completely exposed, offering no cover of any kind to anyone attempting to cross it. This detail would become the hinge on which the entire battle turned. The 9 men of B Squadron had been in Oman for 5 months. Their rotation was ending. G Squadron, their relief, had already arrived at the main British base at al-Quarif in Salalah, 35 miles to the west. The 19th of July, 1972, was officially B Squadron's last operational day in the country. Some of the men had already begun mentally making the transition to the journey home, the particular internal adjustment that soldiers make when a deployment is nearly over, and the abstract idea of safety becomes a near-future reality. Conversations had turned to what came next. Letters had been written. The machinery of ordinary life, suspended for 5 months, was beginning to hum in the background again. None of them would have described themselves as relaxed, because the SAS does not produce men who relax in forward positions, but they were as close to it as the regiment permitted. The morning would revise that condition completely. Their commanding officer was Captain Michael John Anthony Keeley, 27 years old, of the Queen's Regiment, the youngest man to hold that command in the squadron's Oman rotation. Keeley was a compact, serious officer with the quality that the SAS valued above all others in the men it selected. He did not panic. Under pressure that would have caused most men to seek cover and wait for instructions, Keeley's instinct was to move toward the problem, to take personal action, to fill whatever gap the situation created with his own body, if necessary. This quality would save the battle. 7 years later, on a Welsh mountainside, it would kill him. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba had been born in the village of Nawaka in Fiji on the 13th of July, 1942. He had come to Britain as a young man, joining the Royal Ulster Rifles before passing SAS selection and making his way to B Squadron. By 1972, he had already earned the British Empire Medal for gallantry in operations in Borneo and Aden. His comrades called him Laba, and their descriptions of him were consistent across every account. A physical giant, a bear of a man, someone whose presence in a room altered its atmosphere. Pete Winner, who served alongside him, later said that Laba, fully kitted for a mission, was the original Rambo, a man against whom the enemy had no realistic option. What they did not say, because it was not the kind of thing that got said, was that Laba was also generous, warm, and possessed of a particular kind of Fijian social ease that made him universally liked in a regiment not known for easy sentimentality. He had a son named Isaiah back in Fiji. Isaiah was 4 years and 11 months old. Laba was supposed to be home within days of the 19th of July. He died on his 30th birthday. Sergeant Sekonaya Takavesi, known to everyone as Tak or Sek, was a fellow Fijian and Labalaba's closest friend in the regiment. A superior officer once described him as a legend in his own time within the SAS, which in a regiment populated by individuals of extraordinary capability represented recognition of a very high order. He was powerfully built, technically precise with every weapon system the regiment employed, and possessed of the controlled aggression that SAS selection specifically screens for, the ability to apply maximum violence with surgical judgment rather than simple rage. The bond between Labalaba and Takavesi was not simply friendship. They were, as Takavesi later described it, blood brothers. What one did, the other would follow. Trooper Thomas Tobin was the team's medic, a young man of Irish descent whose specific function was to keep wounded men alive. In the gun pit on the morning of the 19th of July, he would attempt to do that job in conditions that defied the very concept of medical care. A man trained to preserve life, working with field dressings and IV lines in a sandbagged hole while the enemy closed to within throwing distance. Alongside him were Corporal Roger Cole, Lance Corporal Pete Warren, Sergeant Bob Bennett, Corporal Taylor, and Trooper Austin Hussey, all experienced operators, all hours from the end of their tour. Also present in the Bat House was a British military intelligence corporal, attached to the Omani intelligence service in an official advisory capacity. He was not SAS. He was not supposed to be a combatant. This distinction would matter very much to the British Army later. It meant nothing at all to him on the morning of the 19th. One more figure deserves mention before the shooting starts. The Bat House also housed a small contingent of Pakistani Askari soldiers, attached in administrative roles because the formal structure of the Sultan's support required their presence. They were not fighters by assignment. They were administrators. When the battle began, they would need to decide, in the space of a few seconds, what they were in fact willing to be. The 25-pounder in number 10 had not been fired in weeks. It sat in its sandbagged emplacement in the pre-dawn darkness of the 19th of July. Its barrel pointed north toward the Jebel, its ammunition stacked nearby. The gun required a trained crew of 4 to 6 men to operate at full effectiveness. Its commander would sight and direct. Its layer would aim and traverse. Its loader would open the breech, insert the propellant charge and the shell, close and lock it. Additional crew would handle the ready supply ammunition. Without a full crew, the gun could still be fired, but the rate of fire would drop dramatically, and the physical demands on whoever was doing multiple jobs simultaneously would be extraordinary. No one on the morning of the 19th was thinking about any of this. The gun was simply there, as it had been for months, part of the background of the position. Half a mile to the north, in the darkness below the Jebel Samhan, 250 men were moving. They moved in silence that was not accidental, but engineered. Their Chinese-made webbing had been muffled with strips of cloth to eliminate the metallic rattling that equipment makes in motion. Their weapons were Soviet AK-47 assault rifles, well-maintained and loaded. They carried DSHK heavy machine guns, capable of firing 12.7 millimeter rounds that could penetrate the sandbagged walls of the Bat House. They had 82 millimeter mortars, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and recoilless rifles. Their radios were tuned to the correct frequencies. Their ammunition was fresh, Russian-supplied, and plentiful. These were not guerrillas improvising from shortages. These were the PFLOAG's best fighters, equipped to a standard that one former SAS officer who encountered the Adu during the campaign later described as the most heavily armed opponents he had faced since the Korean War. They had been selected for this mission because the PFLOAG understood that it could not afford to fail. The force had been assembled over months, drilled on the specific layout of Mirbat's defenses using intelligence gathered from sympathizers in the town, and positioned in the darkness of the Jebel with a precision that reflected weeks of planning. They had chosen the 19th of July with precision. The Kharif, Oman's monsoon season, had draped the Dhofar coastline in thick, low cloud since June. On the morning of the 19th, the cloud base sat at perhaps 300 to 400 feet above the ground, and a light rain had been falling since before midnight. Under these conditions, the Sultan of Oman's Air Force Strikemaster jets, the Bat's most powerful source of fire support, were theoretically grounded. The pilots could not make effective attack runs into a cloud ceiling that low without risking flying directly into the ground. The PFLOAG commanders had studied the weather patterns for months. They understood that the monsoon was their ally, that it neutralized the one advantage the defenders possessed that numbers alone could not overcome. In the cold calculus of that plan, they were correct. On paper, in the darkness before the 19th dawn, 9 men with personal rifles and 1 unmanned artillery piece had no realistic chance against 250 professionals arriving in force. What the PFLOAG commanders did not know, what no one on either side yet understood, was that the same monsoon air they had used as a strategic weapon had been doing something else in the weeks before the assault. It had been filling the air with moisture that seeped into fuse mechanisms and rendered them unreliable. The Khorif that was supposed to be their greatest advantage was quietly degrading their grenades. That detail would decide whether one specific man lived or died. The advance party came first, perhaps a dozen fighters moving with knives rather than firearms to preserve silence. They climbed the small hill called Jebel Ali, 1,000 meters north of Mirbat, and halfway between the town and the Jebel Massif, where a section of Dhofar gendarmerie soldiers were maintaining the overnight picket. The gendarmerie were the early warning system, the tripwire that would alert the bat house to any approaching enemy movement and give the SAS time to man their positions before a full assault began. The Adu knew they were there. They moved through the darkness to within arm's reach of the sleeping sentries before the killing started. It was done quickly and almost silently. Almost. One gendarmerie soldier, in the last seconds of his life, managed to fire a single shot before his throat was cut. That shot, fired by a dying man in the darkness on a small hill, traveled through the monsoon air toward the BATT house below and changed the course of what followed. Captain Keeley heard it. He was already awake, as SAS officers at a forward position in a combat zone tend to be before dawn, and when the shot cracked through the mist from the direction of Jebel Ali, he was at the roof parapet within seconds, scanning north through the darkness and the rain. What he saw made him pause. Through the mist, shapes were moving, many shapes descending from Jebel Ali toward the town, spreading in a broad line as they came. His first thought, entirely reasonable given the circumstances, was that the night picket was returning from its watch position. Soldiers coming off a night guard duty would look in poor visibility and low light, very much like soldiers advancing in a tactical formation. He did not order his men to open fire. He waited. The night picket did not return because the night picket was dead. When the wave of figures kept coming, when the spacing and the pace did not match the movement of men returning to base, when the first glint of metal in the morning light revealed weapons carried not slung, but at the ready, Keeley understood. He gave the order. The bat house erupted. SAS men who had been in their positions for several minutes, watching the same shapes with the same growing unease, did not need to be told twice. L1. A1 self-loading rifles opened up from the roof parapet. The Browning M 2HB 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon that fired rounds the size of a man's thumb at a rate that made sustained fire sound like tearing cloth, began working across the northern approaches. The 81mm mortar crew, Takavizi and Hussey, began dropping rounds in the direction of Jebel Ali within seconds of the order, the characteristic thump and whistle of mortar rounds punching through the pre-dawn quiet. The signaler reached for his radio and began trying to raise al-Khorif, 35 miles away, at Salalah. His hands were steady. This was what they had trained for, every day for years, so that when it arrived, it would not be a surprise, but a known condition, a situation with procedures and responses, not chaos, but war. The Adu responded with everything they had carried down from the Jebel. The DSHK heavy machine guns opened up, their rounds hammering into the BATT house walls and raising geysers of dust and debris from the sandbags on the roof. RPG rounds cracked against the building's exterior, their backblast kicking up plumes of smoke in the wet morning air. 82mm mortar bombs began falling around the position, their detonations walking toward the BAT house in the bracketing pattern of experienced gunners who had sighted their weapons carefully before the assault began. The volume of incoming fire was the first confirmation, if any was needed, of what Keeley was dealing with. A raiding party did not bring this weight of suppression. This was a deliberate assault by a professional force with the intention of overrunning the position entirely. The British military intelligence corporal, the advisor who was not supposed to fight, picked up an SLR rifle from beside a wounded Pakistani askari and moved to the roof parapet without being asked and without being ordered. He would stay there for the duration of the battle. Of the Pakistani soldiers themselves, the initial response was complicated by the fact that their official role gave them every bureaucratic excuse to take cover and wait. Some hesitated. Keeley did not leave them time to think about it for long. Under direct orders, and with the MI corporal's example visible beside them, they took up positions and began firing. The mathematics of the situation were straightforward and brutal. 9 SAS rifles, 1 heavy machine gun, and 1 mortar against 250 fighters equipped with machine guns, rocket launchers, and their own mortars. The SLR was an excellent battle rifle at ranges beyond 800 meters, but the attacking force was not maintaining a polite fighting distance. They were closing. The PFLOAG's tactical doctrine, learned from their South Yemeni and Chinese instructors, called for aggressive advance under fire, pressing the attack before defenders could stabilize, accepting casualties in the forward elements to get the assault force close enough that the defenders' fire support advantage became irrelevant. They had used this approach successfully against the Sultan's regular forces many times. It worked because it was mechanically correct. Against those battalions, it had worked every time. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, with enough gray dawn light now filtering through the monsoon clouds to see the full scale of the attacking formation, Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba looked north from the bat house roof toward the gun pit at number 10, 500 meters away across open ground. He understood what the SLR in his hands could and could not accomplish against 250 advancing fighters. Then he looked at the 25-pounder. Then he went. He did not ask permission. He did not consult Keeley, who was managing the roof defense and the radio simultaneously, and would not have had time to process a request for what Labalaba was about to attempt. He simply went over the sandbag parapet and ran north across the killing ground, toward the gun pit, through fire from the entire attacking force. He was a large man running across flat open ground with no cover, perfectly visible to every enemy fighter with a weapon pointed in his direction, and he did not stop, did not slow, did not deviate. The remaining SAS men on the BATT house roof shifted their fire to provide what covering suppression they could, knowing that it was inadequate but providing it anyway, every barrel trying to occupy the attention of every Adu who might otherwise track a single running figure north across the desert. Labalaba reached the gun pit. The Omani gunner Walid Khamis had been seriously wounded early in the assault, hit while attempting to man the weapon alone, and was no longer able to operate it. Labalaba assessed the situation in the seconds available for assessment. There was a gun, there was ammunition, there was no one else. He took the gun. The QF 25-pounder had been designed to engage targets at ranges of several thousand meters. Lobbing shells in a high arc calculated by a trained gun crew working from range tables, with a separate layer to traverse and elevate the barrel. a loader to handle the brass-cased propellant charges and the shells, and a commander overseeing the whole operation. Labalaba cranked the barrel down to near zero elevation, pointing it directly at the advancing enemy formations rather than angling it skyward for indirect fire. He loaded the gun alone. He fired it alone. He averaged 1 round per minute, each detonation a 25-pound high-explosive shell detonating directly in the path of the advancing force at ranges that caused the blast wave to be felt in the gun pit itself. Bodies were thrown backward. The lead elements of the assault faltered, their advance disrupted by a weapon they had not expected to encounter, firing at point-blank range and direct-fire mode. The 25-pounder, a World War II relic operated by a single man performing a 6-man job, became the fulcrum of the entire battle. For more than an hour, in the monsoon rain, under direct fire from 250 enemy soldiers, who now understood that the gun in number 10 was the thing killing them, and who directed everything they had at silencing it, Talaiasi Labalaba kept firing, 1 round per minute. The gun boomed and recoiled, and he loaded it again. It boomed again. He loaded it again. The wire in front of the gun pit had begun to collect bodies where the closest Adu elements had been stopped by the direct fire. Further back, across the ground between the position and Jebel Ali, the advancing formations had broken into the crouching, rushing movement of fighters trying to close distance under fire, every man using whatever slight contour or scrape the flat desert offered, finding none, pushing forward regardless. The DSK teams shifted their fire continuously toward the gun pit, understanding that the 25-pounder was the engagement's center of gravity. Labalaba worked through all of it, each recoil, each reload, each traversal of the barrel toward the next target, performing in sequence the tasks that the gun's designers had distributed among 6 men. Then a bullet struck him in the jaw. It shattered the bone, tearing through the lower half of his face in a wound that by every medical standard should have stopped him immediately. He reached for his radio. His transmission, which his comrades remembered for the rest of their lives, was, "I've been chinned, but I am okay." He kept firing. On the bat house roof, Keeley heard the transmission. He turned from the parapet and asked for a volunteer to run to Labalaba's aid. The word asked matters. These men were never ordered to their deaths. They were given the choice. Sekonaya Takavesi did not hesitate. He grabbed his SLR and went to the parapet. The remaining SAS men concentrated their fire on the approaches to the gun pit, every barrel working to suppress the Adu closest to the north, trying to clear a corridor through which one man could move 500 meters without being killed. It was the same distance, the same open ground, the same situation Labalaba had already crossed. Takavesi ran it anyway. He reached the gun pit without being hit. Inside, he found Labalaba with his jaw destroyed and blood soaking the front of his uniform, still at the gun. Takavesi dressed the wound as best he could in the dust and noise and incoming rounds, tearing field dressings open with his teeth. Then the 2 Fijians worked the 25-pounder together, one loading while the other traversed, falling into a rhythm that compressed the 6-man operation into 2 wounded men under fire. In front of the gun pit, the wire of the perimeter was hung with the bodies of fighters who had tried to reach the gun and had been stopped by it. Some of the advancing Adu were grabbing the barbed wire with their bare hands and pulling it down, close enough now that the 2 men in the gun pit could see individual faces. Takavesi was shot through the shoulder. He kept working. A second round struck him in the back, more serious than the first. He propped himself against the sandbags, SLR in hand, still firing at the wire and beyond it, bleeding from 2 wounds that, between them, represented a quantity of damage that would have removed most men from the battlefield permanently. Later, when he described the moment, he said simply, "We were pretty short of ammunition, and the battle was getting fiercer." Labalaba, bleeding severely from his shattered jaw, saw the 60mm mortar in the corner of the gun pit, more firepower, another weapon to bring to bear, one more thing between the gun and the men trying to take it. He crawled toward it. A bullet struck him in the neck. He died instantly. The 25-pounder fell silent. Keeley saw the gun stop. He understood in an instant what the silence meant and what it would mean if it continued. A single 25-pounder in direct fire mode had been disrupting an assault by 250 men. Without it, those men would close on the Bat House and the Wally's fort from close range. And at close range, numbers decided everything. He changed from the sandals he had been wearing all morning into his boots. He grabbed Trooper Tobin, the medic, and ran north. The account of what he found in the gun pit is precise enough in the survivor testimony that its details carry the weight of verified fact. Labalaba was face down in the dust, still. Talaiasi was propped against the sandbags with 2 bullet wounds, SLR in his hand, and when he saw Keeley appear in the entrance of the gun pit, he smiled. The Omani gunner Walid Khamis was alive, but gravely wounded. Tobin immediately moved to the most critical casualties, opening his medical kit, setting up intravenous drips for the Omani gunner, working with the compressed efficiency of a man trained to provide medical care in the worst possible conditions. He leaned over the inert body of Labalaba to reach Talaiasi's wounds. A round came through the sandbagged wall. It struck Tobin in the face, destroying his lower jaw. He fell beside Labalaba. Keeley and Talaiasi were now the only men capable of fighting in the gun pit. Keeley fired his personal weapon at every Adu visible through the smoke and the dust, while Talaiasi, with 2 bullets in him, kept working his SLR from a sitting position against the sandbags. Then grenades began landing in the gun pit, thrown from close enough that the Adu throwing them were almost visible. Several exploded, adding shrapnel to the chaos. One landed in Keeley's lap. He looked at it. It did not detonate. A second landed close by. It did not detonate. The monsoon season that the PFLOAG had specifically selected as the condition that would ground the SOAF jets and guarantee their victory had been doing something else simultaneously in the weeks before the 19th. It had been filling the air with moisture that penetrated fuse mechanisms and rendered them unreliable. The weapon the Adu had used as a tactical instrument had degraded their own grenades. Keeley was alive because of the rain. He was still alive, but barely, and alone in any meaningful sense with Talaiasi at the limit of his physical endurance and the enemy at the wire. He had been radioing al-Qwarif throughout the battle, reporting the situation with a clipped precision that the SAS's communications culture demanded, requesting air cover, requesting reinforcements, describing casualties, requesting a helicopter to evacuate Labalaba without knowing that Labalaba was already past evacuation. At al-Qwarif, the reports were being received with mounting urgency by people who understood that the gap between hearing a man describe his situation and being able to do anything about it was measured in miles and weather and the mechanics of military assembly. At Salalah, 35 miles to the west, the morning had been proceeding normally for the newly arrived G Squadron. Some men were preparing for the firing range. Two brand new members of the squadron were looking forward to what they understood would be a familiarization exercise. Then the reports from Keeley began arriving, and Captain Alistair Morrison started making decisions very quickly. He assembled 22 men in approximately 5 minutes, which in any military organization represents a response time that requires either extraordinary training or the specific circumstance of having all the relevant people in one place and already dressed. Several of the men grabbed the nearest available weapons regardless of type, as Morrison later noted, with an impressive array of firepower assembled in the time it would normally take to find a duty roster. The two new members of the squadron, still under the impression they were heading to some kind of exercise, boarded the helicopters with everyone else. They would understand shortly. Simultaneously, at the SOAF airfield, the Strike Master pilots were looking at the cloud base and making a calculation that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with the specific nature of what they knew was happening on the ground below those clouds. The cloud base was dangerously low, 300 to 400 feet, perhaps less in places. Flying attack runs into that ceiling meant operating at an altitude where a navigational error of seconds would mean flying into the ground. The weight of fire coming up from the Adu formations below was already heavy enough that one Strike Master took serious damage on its first run and was forced to return to base, its pilot making the only rational decision available to him while everyone else kept going. The decision to fly at all, in conditions that gave them every professional excuse to stay on the ground, was its own act of a particular kind of courage that receives less attention than the kind performed on foot. The remaining aircraft came in at an altitude measured in dozens of feet rather than hundreds, barely beneath the gray monsoon ceiling, machine guns firing in sustained bursts along the Adu formations, light rockets punching into the concentrations of fighters that had gathered along the northern approaches to Mirbat. In the gun pit, bleeding from 2 wounds and down to his last magazines, Talaiasi heard it first. The specific high-pitched scream of a jet engine at very low altitude, traveling very fast, is a sound that has no natural equivalent in the world, and in the gun pit on the morning of the 19th of July, 1970, it was the most beautiful sound that Sekonaya Talaiasi had ever heard. Years later, in the careful language of a man who had spent his career in an institution that did not encourage sentiment, he struggled to describe it accurately. He settled for, it was the sound of surviving. The Strike Masters worked the Adu formations from the air as Morrison's helicopters closed from the south. The assault force, which had been advancing with discipline and coherence for the better part of 6 hours, began to come apart under the combined pressure of air attack from above and the ground fire that the BATT house defenders had maintained throughout. One Strike Master pilot, pushing the boundaries of safe operation in the low cloud, dropped a 500-pound bomb on the wadi to the north, where large concentrations of Adu had taken cover after the aerial strafing began, and the explosion was large enough that its shockwave was felt several hundred meters away. Morrison's helicopters touched down south of Mirbat. The G Squadron force immediately made contact with an Adu rearguard patrol covering the southern approaches, fighters positioned specifically to slow any relief force coming from Salalah. They were cornered in a cave and offered the opportunity to surrender. They refused. 66mm Law rockets and GPMG fire ended the engagement in minutes. The two new members of the squadron, who had by this point been under fire for long enough to understand, with complete certainty, that they were not on an exercise, fought with the instinctive competence that SAS selection exists to identify. Morrison's force swept through Mirbat from south to north, clearing buildings and alleyways. the strike masters still working overhead, the Adu caught between air above and infantry below, their command structure dissolving in the face of a tactical situation their plan had not anticipated. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, the surviving Adu broke and retreated toward the Jebel. They moved north in the disorganized urgency of men who have discovered that a plan which seemed mathematically guaranteed has produced a result that is mathematically impossible. They carried their dead and wounded with them, as guerrilla forces in that kind of terrain routinely did to deny intelligence to the enemy. They left behind 38 bodies that the British and Omani forces recovered from the ground around the position. The total Adu casualties, including those carried away and those killed by the airstrikes, were estimated at between 80 and 200 men. Half the attacking force, by some estimates, was killed or wounded in a single engagement. Talaiasi walked to the evacuation helicopter unaided. With 2 bullets in him, one through the shoulder and one through the back, he walked out of the gun pit and across the same open ground that had been a killing field for 6 hours and climbed into the aircraft under his own power. The Omani gunner Walid Khamis was carried to the first available flight. Tobin was evacuated still alive, his lower jaw destroyed by the round that had taken him as he bent over Labalaba's body. He did not survive. In the days that followed, a tooth fragment aspirated during the trauma reached his lungs and caused the infection that killed him. He died of his wound, just not instantly. Labalaba did not need a helicopter. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Martin's Church in Hereford, where the regiment keeps its dead close. What the battle had been intended to accomplish was revealed by the men Morrison's force captured. 3 Adu prisoners were taken for interrogation, and the intelligence they provided confirmed the full scope of the plan. The town held for days, the governor executed publicly, the population subjected to political instruction, then a clean withdrawal into the Jebel, leaving behind the evidence of the revolution's continuing power. Mirbat was meant to be the moment that reversed the war's momentum, that proved no town was safe, that re-established the PFLOAG's credibility with a population that was beginning to question its inevitability. What it produced instead, in 6 hours of fighting, was the catastrophic destruction of approximately half a professional assault force of 250 elite fighters at the cost of 2 British soldiers. The psychological effect within the PFLOAG was severe and immediate. The kangaroo courts began within days, commanders accusing each other of incompetence, of intelligence failures, of tactical errors that had turned a guaranteed victory into a disaster. The men who had ordered the assault, and those who had led it, faced internal tribunals in which the political consequences of failure were distributed according to rank and faction rather than logic. The defection rate, already rising before the 19th of July, accelerated sharply. Men who had been uncertain began crossing to the Sultan's side. Men who had been loyal began reconsidering. The battle had not simply failed militarily, it had fractured the PFLOAG's internal credibility with the very fighters whose commitment it depended on. By 1974, the movement had contracted its stated ambitions enough to rename itself the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman, quietly dropping the Arabian Gulf that had represented its pan-regional revolutionary aspirations, an implicit acknowledgement that those aspirations had died at Mirbat. Iranian troops arrived in 1973 to reinforce the Sultan's forces, drawn by the Shah's explicit recognition that the Strait of Hormuz's security was worth fighting for. The Hornbeam Line, a fortified barrier running north from the coast to interdict the supply routes from South Yemen, was established and held. The Adu were steadily pushed westward, then contained, then reduced. The Dhofar War ended in 1976. The Sultan's forces, backed by the British and the Iranians, had won. Oman remained in the western sphere of influence. The Strait of Hormuz remained open. The SAS lost 12 men in the entire campaign. The Western world's oil supply was never threatened. None of it was reported. The awards took 3 years to announce. The British government, having fought a secret war, was not prepared to begin acknowledging it by publishing Victoria Cross citations that would generate headlines in every newspaper in the country. The Distinguished Service Order for Keeley was announced in 1975, 3 years after the battle. The Distinguished Conduct Medal for Talaiasi came at the same time. Bob Bennett and Corporal Taylor each received the military medal. Labalaba received a posthumous mention in dispatches, the lowest possible recognition for gallantry, lower than the individual medals given to men whose contributions to the battle were vastly smaller than his. Tobin received nothing official from the British government at all. The British military intelligence corporal who had spent the entire battle on the roof of the Bat House, fighting alongside the SAS in a capacity that was officially unauthorized, received a gallantry medal from the Sultan of Oman, Oman's recognition of what he had done. The British Army's response to his gallantry was to threaten him with disciplinary action for being directly involved in combat operations he had not been cleared to participate in. He had helped save the position. His own institution wanted to punish him for it. He is the award scandal in a single human life. A man the system was willing to let die in battle, but unwilling to acknowledge as having fought in one. Pete Winner, who fought at Mirbat and later participated in the 1980 Iranian embassy siege, said of Labalaba, "The guy deserved a VC for what he did." They wanted to give him a VC, but because the war was secret in 1970, they said it would be headlines in every newspaper in the UK. Sekonaya Takavesi, who was there in the gun pit when Labalaba died, who was shot twice and kept firing, who walked out of the battle under his own power and spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that morning, said, "I think all the people involved should have been given medals. The enemy were totally destroyed, but it was very sad to see Laba and Tobin die." The real reason for the inadequacy of the awards was not procedural. It was not that the actions did not meet the standard for higher recognition. The criteria for the Victoria Cross are clear: most conspicuous bravery, or some daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice. A man who sprinted 500 meters across an open killing ground, manned a 6-man artillery weapon alone, continued firing after a bullet destroyed his jaw, and died crawling toward a mortar to bring more firepower to bear against 250 attackers, had met that standard beyond any reasonable debate. The British government chose political deniability over justice, protected its secret war with the decorations its soldiers had earned, and announced the consolation prizes 3 years late in the hope that no one was paying attention. They were correct. No one in 1975 was paying attention to a war they had never been told was happening. Mike Keeley survived the battle that defined his career and spent the years afterward doing what the SAS does: training, selecting, maintaining the standards of a regiment that had just proven in Oman what it was capable of. On the 1st of February, 1979, he joined a group of SAS candidates on a selection march in the Brecon Beacons in South Wales. The weather had been deteriorating since morning, temperature dropping, wind rising. the Welsh hills providing the particular misery they reserve for people who choose to walk across them in winter. Keely had packed his Bergen with bricks rather than cold weather gear, a technique for adding weight to simulate an operational load that was common practice among those who wanted to push harder than the standard equipment would allow. He had no insulating layers. When the weather worsened to the point where the march became dangerous, when the wind chill produced conditions in which exposure could kill within hours, Keely was already committed to a route from which the return was as difficult as the advance. A two-man search party found him alive but critically impaired, his pulse weak, his consciousness intermittent, his body temperature dangerously low. They moved him into a survival bag. One of the searchers climbed in beside him, using his own body heat to try to warm the man who had survived Mirbat. They offered him a warm blanket. He refused it. In the advanced stages of hypothermia, the reasoning faculties are among the first casualties, and the same iron refusal to accept any accommodation of weakness that had kept him moving toward the gun pit in Mirbat, rather than behind the sandbags of the bat house, now worked against him at a cellular level, dismissing the help that might have saved his life. He was brought off the mountain 19 hours after he was first reported missing. He was dead on arrival. He was 33 years old. His old Dhofar commander, the man who had sent him to Oman, Colonel Johnny Watts, found his body. His name is on the Battle of Mirbat Memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, alongside Labalaba and Tobin, the only survivor of the three whose names are carved into the stone. The story spent decades in the classified filing systems of the British government and the memory of the men who had been there, neither of which is an adequate substitute for public record. The Dhofar War did not enter the mainstream British historical consciousness the way that the Falklands or the Gulf War would. It was small, secret, successful, and therefore of limited use to an institution that prefers its military history to involve dramatic setbacks overcome by massive expenditure and national mobilization. A war won quietly by a few hundred men using intelligence, patience, and the willingness to live among the people they were trying to protect did not generate the kind of political narrative that governments like to tell about themselves. It was filed away. Roger Cole, who had been on the roof of the Bat House on the morning of the 19th and had watched Labalaba run for the gun pit from a distance of 500 meters, spent 39 years thinking about it before he wrote it down. His book, SAS, Operation Storm, published in 2011, was the first full-length account of the battle ever written for a general audience. He stated his purpose plainly. The book was intended, among other things, as a vehicle for restarting the campaign to award Talaiasi Labalaba a posthumous Victoria Cross. Parliamentary petitions had been submitted. Lord Ashcroft, the Conservative peer and military medal collector who had sponsored the Battle of Mirbat Memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum in 2008, made his view public. The courage had been earned and the recognition had been withheld for reasons that were political, not meritorious. The campaign continues. As of the time of this telling, no posthumous Victoria Cross has been awarded. The memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum, with its carved names and its Fijian motto, Reravaka na kalu ka doka natui, fear God and honor the Queen, is one of two permanent physical monuments to Labalaba in the world. The other stands at Nadi International Airport in Fiji. A statue unveiled in October of 2018 by the Duke of Sussex during a royal visit to the islands. Present at the ceremony was Isaiah Dere Labalaba, the son who had last seen his father in 1971 when Laba left for his final tour. Isaiah was 4 years and 11 months old at that last meeting. He was 51 when he watched the Duke unveil the statue. Across a gap of nearly 5 decades, he spoke of his pride and his grief with the measured grace of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to hold both at once. The actual 25-pounder from the gun pit in Mirbat, the weapon that Labalaba manned alone, that Talaiasi helped him fire, that fell silent when its operator was killed and remained silent until the strike masters arrived, is preserved in the Royal Artillery Museum at Woolwich, now called the Firepower Museum. The bullet holes in its gun shield, made by the rounds that struck it during the battle, have not been repaired. They are still there. Physical evidence of a morning when a man stood at a piece of machinery and refused to leave it, refused to accept that the arithmetic of 250 against 1 was a calculation that applied to him. The Dhofar campaign is studied today at military colleges as the benchmark example of a successful Western-led counterinsurgency, the only one in the modern history of the Middle East that produced an unambiguous and durable result. Its lessons were absorbed, referenced, and partially applied in Iraq and Afghanistan, with results that said something pointed about which elements of the model transferred and which required conditions that do not exist everywhere. What worked in Dhofar was not a secret, and it was not principally military. It was the specific combination of armed presence with genuine investment in the welfare of the people being asked to choose a side, the wells dug alongside the ambushes set, the clinics opened in villages that had never been offered them. The former enemies recruited and trusted and paid rather than imprisoned or executed. The SAS's methods in Oman shaped British Special Forces doctrine for decades afterward, producing a template that later commanders studied intensely and then found themselves unable to fully replicate in the political pressures of later conflicts where the patience required was in shorter supply than the firepower. The model that worked in Dhofar worked because everyone involved understood that winning meant being worth following, not just being hard to fight. The 9 men who held Mirbat on the 19th of July, 1970, to prove something that the official history of the Cold War has been reluctant to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the war, they proved that a handful of professional soldiers, given the right doctrine, the right training, and the commitment to do whatever the situation required, regardless of what the procedure manual specified, could change the outcome of a conflict that shaped the world they lived in, not through overwhelming force, not through technological superiority, through the refusal of one man, shot through the jaw, to stop firing a gun that a textbook said required 6 men to operate. The British government told itself a story about Oman for years afterward, that it had been a limited advisory mission, that the SAS presence had been minimal, that the decisive factor in the victory was the Sultan's own reforms and his forces' eventual professionalization. This story required the minimization of what happened at Mirbat, the deliberate inadequacy of the awards, the 3-year delay before even those inadequate awards were announced. The real reason the Victoria Cross was withheld from Talaiasi Labalaba was never about propriety or precedent. The real reason was that properly recognizing it would have made the secret too loud to keep. He was a man from Fiji who came to Britain, joined the best fighting regiment in the world, earned his place in it through whatever combination of physical capacity and personal quality SAS selection exists to test, went to a war his government refused to acknowledge, and on the morning of his 30th birthday ran 500 meters across open ground to man an artillery gun alone under fire from 250 soldiers. When a bullet destroyed his jaw, he radioed that he was okay and kept firing. When a bullet killed him, the gun pit fell to the man who had run to help him and the captain who had run after them both, neither of whom had been ordered to make that run. Laba, Tommy Tobin, and the 9 men of B Squadron proved that the mathematics of survival are not, in the end, purely mathematical. They proved that the gap between what should have been possible and what actually happened can be filled by a single decision made by a single individual, without orders and without hesitation. The British government spent years trying to keep that truth classified. They ran out of time. Now you know it.